Welcome everybody. In this video I'm going to build Tiger I Ausf H1V1, the very first prototype, the first Tiger tank vehicle with its movable Vorpanzer. I'm going to convert this out of an obsolete kit by now, RFM's first initial release of the early 1943 North Africa front Tiger tank. If you would like to attempt this conversion yourself, I would recommend you use this kit instead, since it makes up for a lot of the shortcomings of the first initial release. All files you need to 3D print your own conversion are provided via Patreon. If you don't own a 3D printer, there are licensed merchants offering you this through eBay. You are watching Tank Brusher 1/35 scale German armor. Let's dig into it. Since I would like to start up with the turret, the first challenge is the two-piece outer shell I have to tackle here. This step falls away if you go with a more modern release. I personally will not talk about putting together a generic RFM kit in this video. I have already done this for the upgraded version of this kit. Watch my Tiger 142 video or the Tiger 100 that will be released after this project. Both of these builds are more specific about the kit. I'm here going only into the specific properties of H1V1. Now I have the rear filled and sanded. Have a good look at the orientation of the pistol ports. RFM refuses to have this right, with the exception of Tiger 100. After being captured, the correct orientation is what I've shown here. On the turret roof I use the loader hatch with the weld seam around, and on the photos I can spot this vehicle is in a partial deep weighting configuration using the watertight cover for the turret ventilator. There's one thing we have to remove on this turret roof, and these are the locator marks for the smoke discharger brackets. They have to be removed. That's a case of just sanding them down, nothing too spectacular. A little bit more complicated is fixing the cupola or converting it. First I filled the holes for the spring mechanism. There was no counterweight or spring load system for the hatch on B1. The second thing is removing all the studs. On a cupola there are bolt heads, not nuts used. Chances are high that this is fixed in the Eastern Front release, since we have a newly tuned cupola, but you have to watch the video to find out for sure. Now let's continue with the commander's hatch. First, removing all of the geometry that is related to the spring-loaded counterweight system. I know some of you guys would summarize this under basic modeling skills, yet it is quite tricky to get in there with the blade, not damaging the existing structure and yet removing everything that isn't supposed to be there. Yet I skipped drilling two microscopic small holes around the hinge mechanism in the area of this. Last but not least, I tried to scrape a new line, just altering a little bit the geometry of the hinge. There needs to go a step in there. I can understand if some of you are thinking now, hey, why not 3D print the whole thing instead of fiddling around here with a dull blade? The reason is simply time efficiency. This is a unicorn, a one-off. There is no other hatch looking like this one. And the second reason is this is an opportunity to display this commander's hatch being opened at a 90-degree angle from vertical. A single one opportunity, even I will go for it. I usually close the hatches when nothing is inside. But here it's different. It's a feature of this vehicle is the opening angle of the hatch. And this weights higher for me than having a accurate inside-outside representation in 3D. Second to last step is constructing a new stop for the hatch, a new resting stop. That's just done with some photo etch thread that is left over. I usually keep these around, they come in handy every now and then. I just clip this off, bend it to shape, clip it off again, clean up the edges with some careful sanding. I really noticed the difference in quality of sanding sticks. This one here I reshaped the sanding stick instead of shaping the brass. Okay, but now let's just mount this thing using a pair of tweezers and some CA glue, and let's finalize the commander's hatch for good by mounting the levers you use to close the whole thing. These are outsourced from RFM's 5001U kit, the Tiger 142 I did build, since they had in the initial kit the wrong shape. This is now the correct alignment. Further, I did remove the cupola again and placed the clear parts inside. Now that the hatch is open, something needs to be in there. Okay, this does sum up the complete turret roof. It's time to move to the front and get the turret done finally. The first and effectively only real modification is done to the gun mantlet. I have to sand down this machined surface. I had a quick chat with Mr. Burton about this. The idea behind this machined surface is how well the whole thing lined up during machining, and there is no deeper meaning behind it. Here on the individual one, the H1V1, we do have a cast surface there, and therefore I stipple it on using Tamiya glue, just tapping it into submission until I get a unified cast texture. This works quite well, and the result does not need to hide itself. Let me point one more thing out here. This is a Porsche Tiger mantlet. It has this small little notch cut out. Compare this to a conventional one without a notch. I do see V1 using a Porsche Tiger mantlet, but I'm open for debate. Unfortunately, RFM did remove it from the mold, so you would have to modify it yourself, cutting this small notch. Other than this, I only had to fill and sand a little gap on the front of the muzzle that occurred when putting the parts together. The gun itself had the correct length out of the box, and this concludes or summarizes the conversion process of the turret to the H1V1 turret. Most unnecessary conversion part was the commander's hatch, I think. At least I can sleep better now, even though it rests with all the modifications upside down. But now, okay, it's time to move on dealing with the chassis. In order to save us some time, I did the generic part of the assembly already, gluing on some hull sides, the swing arms from the torsion bar system, and so on. But here, this is the conversion set for the Vorpanzer, consisting of the hull extensions, the lower lever, upper lever, and bits and pieces like pins and holding brackets for the lower lever. The front glaze, yes, of course, and the skirt, the armored skirt itself. This is the Vorpanzer. This gets lowered down to protect the final drive in the end. Side note, the whole thing for a 3D print, this is pretty straight, slow drying process, and your parts won't twist that much. The installation process is pretty straightforward, just using CA glue here applied with a nail, so I can get into all the nooks and crannies. Other than this, there is not much to working with these 3D printed parts. They come out pretty clean and work really well. You need a sanding stick or a file. For larger pieces it can be better to just using a Dremel tool to get them off the support structure, but none of such large parts are included here in this build. I'm looking forward to print my own tank. Let me briefly address the small differences for the circles where the final drive goes. RFM made some design decisions here, altering the original measurements given by Tiger1.info, that's David Burton's site. I choose not to follow RFM but used original measurements, since I can't guess where the center spot is perfectly and the dimensions are not possible to obtain with the measurement tools I have. I can't get in there. Nevertheless, it fits together. And now the front plate is installed. You can clearly see when the Vorpanzer dropped out of the design, a mudguard was replaced instead. And the armored side extensions of the front glaciers were removed during this time. I'm installing now the Fahrerseeklappe 100, the driver's visor. Its shot deflector goes in the front of it. Now to the Vorpanzer itself, the armored skirt that gets lowered or raised in front of the final drive and drive sprocket area in order to protect it. The first type of lever needs to be installed. It goes on the lower sector. I use 3D printed brackets to make it movable. There are peg marks already in the print, so the alignment should not be too much of an issue. The whole thing is again glued with CA glue, making sure I get no spillage into the joint itself, so it remains movable. And the upper lever, it's just stuck in there. There's a sleeve that goes along with it. There is no gluing necessary in this case. And I have to be really careful when adjusting the fit here, because resin is brittle. Home printed resin is really brittle. I can't emphasize this enough. It's the only one downside of the whole process. But nevertheless, we are not building a children's toy here. We are building a scale model. And after installing the pins, the whole thing remains movable. I hope so, at least. Now, the whole thing worked out really well. And the second pin is a little bit smaller. It can be fixed in place by carefully adding a little bit CA glue to the inside of the hole using a nail or a needle. This worked out perfectly. And you see I get some binding here. I have to move this left, right side. So I removed the front glacis again with CA glue. This was not a problem. And made sure I get a little bit less material in the binding area. I updated the design accordingly. The final drive is installed now. Vorpanzer slides up and down perfectly smooth, just the way I wanted to have it, and even better than I expected it, to be quite honest. I'm finishing now the lower front by mounting this armored plate. If you're particularly fancy, you can match the shape from a 3D printed part to this one with filing. The wing nuts used for securing the watertight cover over the ball mount needs to go on V1. They were not present yet. Yeah, I'm a little bit an idiot. I did cut into the armor plate. Whatever. Okay, the real challenge when dealing with the side plate is recreating these notches. At least for me, I have no fitting tools for this task. I could have gone to the milling machine, but the milling machine runs way too slow and I didn't want to crush the hull in the vise. Whatever, I took the file and then I heated it and just melted in the notch, cleaned it up afterwards. All I can say, I have to invest in a new chisel to deal with this kind of task. All the other attachment points need to be removed, and this step completely falls away when using the RFM Eastern Front kit. Moving on to the drive area, I use again my 3D printed wheels for the outer two layers, because the rim is quite different to what RFM gives us in the kit. RFM's road wheels are standard early road wheels, but there was an initial type 2. Drive sprocket I had left from my Tiger 142 build, but the one I need for the sprocket hub is a little bit wider and it's only included in the new Eastern Front release, so I had to print my own. These are a little bit wider. You can see a more distance between the outer bolt circle and where the rim ends. For tracks I've already prepared a set of my 3D printed ones utilizing track pins, much faster to assemble than the kit ones, and they sag nicely, look really good. One thing to note is H1 V1 was running on standard tracks. They did find out there's a change in resistance from one side to another, aka the vehicle drifts off to one side. This is why mirror tracks were issued in the first place, but not on this tank yet. Moving on to the main deck, all parts have to be removed that are related to tow cables or cleaning rods or anything that has to do with tools in general. This is a lot of work, unnecessary work. If you go with the kit I actually advise you to use, the new RFM 5075, we get a pretty clean deck already where we can work off with a lot of less time involvement, I guess. Nevertheless, a lot of stuff still has to be sanded and filled. One of them are the drivers and radio operators hatches. Both had no periscopes yet, so the slit has to be filled. I'm using Revell putty here. This dries relatively fast and does shrink only a bit. So there's still 2 passes necessary for a satisfying result. The areas where the cleaning rod holders were attached are a little bit damaging the weld seam. There is no flow in this direction anymore, so I have to repair it, soaking it first a little bit in Tamiya extra thin and then hacking away at it as to the point where it starts to look like a weld bead again. I'm really terrible in such things, altering the shape of plastic and doing scratch building techniques, so don't judge me too hard. I'm still learning this stuff. 3D printing is very easy in comparison. Moving on now to the rear section finally, where I have to remove What would be the latching mechanism for keeping the vent covers open in later chassis numbers? In V1 they still had a design with an hydraulic piston opening this thing remotely. This was dropped, of course, because they're unnecessary feature effectively, but still this is a little bit hackslaying going on here, carving out the counterpart on the grill itself, restoring its shape. This is something I would have loved to 3D print, but actually this is a really complex part and would have cost me the better part of a week, I guess. Nevertheless, it's easy enough to adjust the plastic part, so I leave it standing as it is. On the engine hatch, everything related to the Fievel pre-filter system has to be deleted, of course, and so has to be the secondary venting slit. There were fumes building up in the engine compartment, and therefore a secondary venting slit was added starting with the chassis number 1. V1 itself didn't have this feature, so we have to close it. This is the largest gap that has to be filled in and closed up, but it's again only a 2-pass operation with some putty. This is after the first pass. There is nothing too complicated actually doing this yourself, therefore I didn't print another hatch. The rear section is now finished. I'm moving back to the front, installing a horn in the front. It is partially visible on one photograph, and at least 2 more photographs show there is clearly no horn, but it's in Doyle's drawing and I leave it be, since there's no real harm done. Last thing here is adding some wire conduits. These are not a wire itself, but there's an armored conduit. Compare this to chassis number 2. I built a Dragon one. Now there's a lamp installed, and having not a lamp installed I think makes for a good storytelling. I did steal the Schnorchel out of the Eastern Front release, completing the engine deck with this. Let's have an overview. In front we have 2 lamps, the horn, all the tool holders are removed, all the tow cable holders are removed, periscope covers are removed. Engine deck is backdated by removing the hinges, removing the secondary air intake, and the Schnorchel is installed. Now to the final section of the build, the rear wall, finally. We have again everything needs to be removed that is related to the Fievel filter system, as well as the studs have to go where the inertia starter adapter would be installed. We see these studs in the next chassis numbers already popping up, but I don't think they were present on V1. However, I did keep the attachment point for the trailer, for the fuel trailer, since it was part of the vehicle description all in all. That's why I kept it. It's a little bit different from the drawing made by Doyle. All the holes are filled. We don't attach anything related to covers for the exhaust. The exhaust themselves, I did glue on a disc on top of them. This is just a generic part from the sprue to finish this off. There was not yet a flapper or this sealing cap installed that would allow you to air tighten the whole thing for deep weighting. Then I installed some 3D printed mud flaps. These are a hit and miss in Rye Field Models kit. They did it first wrong, then they did it right, and now they're doing it wrong again. So I was finally fed up with it and printed my own version. This is how they are supposed to look like. The ribs are generating a small and a large section, and there is a hole in each rib. Can be a grip, maybe, maybe not, we don't know. Of course, these parts are not mirrored and now are installed correctly. Last print that was missing includes the convoy light antenna socket and the horn. Here I installed the antenna socket that goes in the right upper corner of the rear wall. There was never an antenna installed actually on what I can see, but the first 8 or 9 vehicles of this type did have this feature. Then it was covered over with a plate and later removed completely. On the Africa versions we don't see this anymore because of the Fievel filters installed on them. The tail light or convoy light gave me a really hard time installing it. I don't know why this instant glue didn't glue instantly. Yeah, sometimes the hard things are the easiest one and the easiest ones are the hard things. Now, a full overview: convoy light, mudguard, all holes are filled, fiber filter system is completely removed. The armored guards for the outlets for the exhausts are still the same we see in the initial ones later on. Then the attachment point for the fuel trailer, I kept. Antenna socket I made and mounted. This is not necessary going with the 5075 kit. It already includes the two printed parts on this section. But now it's finally done. It's time to put everything together. Playing with the Vorpanzer, installing the deck. I don't glue this on here in this video because I have something in mind for a radiator compartment I could not have shown you now. This will be part of the painting process, paint and weathering process. I think I go with a full primer color on this one. Now turret on chassis and the whole thing is finished. We can play with the Vorpanzer a little bit longer. This works so well. I'm really happy about the whole thing, how it came out. This video was published to Patreon 2 weeks before you guys have seen it on YouTube. It's a small thank you for these guys making a huge difference to the possibility a small grading channel like mine has. I would like to thank you very much. Thank you guys on Patreon for your support. Thank you guys on YouTube for watching my video and maybe enjoying the content. If you do so, please leave me a subscription and a thumbs up. See you next time. Happy modeling.